This is my review of 12 Years a Slave, the story of Solomon Northup. Now I know what the first question you're going to have. You're going to wonder, am I reviewing the movie or the book? The answer is maybe both. I mean, it does not necessarily have to be one or the other. But spoiler alert, this is more about the movie than it is about the book. And as you view this clip of mine, you'll begin to understand why. 12 Years a Slave, the movie, was actually two different movies. There was the theatrical release in 2013, which we all have heard of. If you have any interest in the details of Black history in America, you saw this movie. It's another of those movies where everyone I know who would have seen it liked it. It was very popular and won countless awards. And then there was the other television version of 12 Years a Slave, more precisely called Solomon Northup's Odyssey, which I assumed had been called 12 Years a Slave. I only discovered many years later that it was actually called Solomon Northup's Odyssey. It was released in the mid-'80s, and I'd be surprised if anyone remembers it besides me, because it was not just the television version, but the PBS version. And let's face it, their audience range back in the mid-'80s is roughly the same as it is now. So if you wanted to see me do a backover flip, then say something like, "Yeah, Rickey, I remember that version of 12 Years a Slave." That was the one which starred Avery Brooks in the lead role, which is the same Avery Brooks everyone has forgotten or don't even remember existed. If you remember anything about him at all, it was that he starred in the early sequence of the Star Trek serials, and that was all they would remember. This PBS version of 12 Years a Slave was directed by Gordon Parks, who is a filmmaker you can Google if you don't know who he is. I can say right off the bat, there is no way you can compare the two different versions of 12 Years a Slave side by side, because one was a slick, high-gloss Hollywood production on a huge budget, whereas the other was on a PBS budget, which is kind of like no budget at all in comparison. The feature film version starred, and hey, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce his name. I'm sure that Hollywood version probably spent more on the cost of catering food for the cast and crew than the entirety of the TV version. So this has to do little with how one looked in comparison to the other. I did not like the big budget theatrical version of 12 Years a Slave. I just didn't. There was nothing in it which was memorable. I thought the camera spent far too much time with close-ups on his face and that endless, brooding expression. Even when he had sex with whatever her name was laying next to him, it was obvious he was doing it more out of obligation than enjoyment. His entire focus was on getting back to the free life he enjoyed before he was kidnapped, which you'd think was supposed to have been the purpose of the entire movie. Well, yeah. But it was at the sacrifice of character development of the supporting cast. I did not get a true sense of what they were about.
I ain't felt the end of a lash in more years I can't recall. I ain't worked a field neither.
And the role Alfre Woodard played. Excuse me? What was she there for?
Current existence, Beatmaster Shaw broadcasting his affections and me enjoying the pantomime of his fidelity. If that what keep me from cotton picking niggas, that what it be.
This is one of those times where I am admitting to being harder on the movie than perhaps I should be. You see, it was because I had already seen the PBS version of 12 Years a Slave 30 years earlier. And when I sat down to watch this latest big budget release version, I knew right off the bat they would have a tough act to follow. Because when I watched that version, which starred Avery Brooks, that moved me. So much so that after watching the 2013 version too, I was compelled to find the 1980s version 1, rent it on DVD, so that I could rip myself a copy of it to maintain. And when I watched it again 30 years later, I was just as moved as I had been when I saw it for the very first time. That theatrical release, while glossy and well produced, could not hold a candle to what Gordon Parks put together in what must have been a shoestring budget, especially when it came to developing the characters around Solomon while he was enslaved. Maybe I'm biased because I like Gordon Parks anyway. He did wonderfully on The Learning Tree, which is another movie you never heard of. And the job he did with Avery Brooks in the lead of the story of Solomon Northup, as far as I'm concerned, nothing else comes close to it. Now, about the book. I'll admit to never reading the book on which the original story was based. It was not until after I had seen both film versions. I got this thing about audiobooks. I am such a huge fan of audiobooks. It was over 15 years ago that I came to realize I could absorb much more from listening to the audio version of a book than I ever could from reading it with my eyes. That's just me. So by the time I got around to reading 12 Years a Slave, what I really mean is it was when I checked it out, its audio version on disc from my free library, and listened to it. Whenever I do listen to audio books that way, I always rip a copy and keep it for myself. They are a huge companion to me on long drives and long flights. They are great. And it's nothing to me to go back and re-listen to one that I have already listened to several times, because I can do other things while I am listening, which I can't do while I am reading it or watching it on the screen. There were two similar books that I listened to years before I got around to 12 Years a Slave. And if their titles sound strikingly familiar, I think you'll get the picture. The first was 30 Years a Slave, which went on to become one of my favorite books to repeat listen. The other one was 50 Years a Slave, which I think was really something like 50 Years in Chains. Neither of these did I check out from my local library. I found them online at a free download site. As much as I liked 30 Years a Slave, I liked 50 Years in Chains even more. It was one of my top repeat listens. Now you are saying to yourself, Rickey, this is supposed to be a review of the films and book on 12 Years a Slave. Now you're going off talking about similar books about other people. I had to say all of that to explain why I didn't like the book version of 12 Years a Slave all that much. You know what they say, that the book version is so much better than the movie ever could be. Well, I'm not so sure if that applies, because the book version not being all that long. I credit the book version for following up on what happened after Solomon returned from slavery and his efforts to get those responsible for his imprisonment brought to justice, which the PBS version did not touch upon at all. But again, it was a book I was trying to read after already hearing about the plights of two other men in similar circumstances. One in prison for 30 years and the other for 50 years. And if you want to understand more fully what it means to describe graphic details, get a hold of Charles Ball's 50 Years in Chains. Because after reading his account, it makes everyone else's seem like a walk in the park. It is so suspense-driven that to this day, when I am listening to certain of his accounts again, I'm on the edge of my seat wondering what's going to come next, when I kind of already know, having listened to it before a million times. That's how riveting it is. So, sorry, book version of 12 Years a Slave, it simply was not the same. Incidentally, the audio version of the book Roots by Alex Haley was narrated by Avery Brooks, which in and of itself was a tremendous feat, because the size of that book wasn't no joke. It had to have been 1,000,000 pages long. And while I may someday do a book review on Roots, I'm not going to do a similar review of Roots on television or the later recent cable or online version of it, because I don't think all of that is necessary.